Okay. First of all, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction of the three of us. We never realized actually we were so broad until it was put on paper. So I'm surprised myself a little bit. The second is I really would like to express our deepest gratitude and thanks to the university and the faculty and Andre and the colleagues who have been who accepted to organize this event for the World Bank. It's a pleasure and honor for us to be here and share our results and some of the policy recommendations and implications with a distinguished group of people, including the academics and students who are on their road to real life situations like we were some years ago, which I am not even going to mention the number of years. So thank you so much for organizing this event. I should probably start without getting into the details of the presentation first to give you what is really World Development Report. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with the product, but World Development Report is one of the biggest flagships of the World Bank institution, and it is it's a report that is written over a period of a 12 months, 15-year period. And mostly it is, the topics change every year, and they are all related to somehow development. And this year it has been, they determined the topic to be risk, uncertainty, and crisis. That was how it had started. And some team has been formed in a short period of time. We were all assigned our responsibilities and started brainstorming about this whole event. And over a period of 1 or 2 months, we really focused our attention to a specific aspect of risk and uncertainty, because it's such a general topic. It can go anywhere from natural risk, disaster risks, to economic risks, financial sector risks. So it was a pretty broad effort and intensive effort to focus our attention to what we really wanted to do with this topic. So eventually we decided to focus the discussions on risk and opportunity and what it really means for development. Okay, let me experiment first whether I'm going to, okay, there you go. Before I go into the details of the findings, I wanted to leave you a key message that we really wanted our audience to really remember. And that one is, in the face of uncertainty, in an uncertain world, preparation in good times is essential for resilience in bad times and prosperity forever. So this is pretty much the key message. It's a simple message, but it's a very important one, which really illustrates the importance of preparation and managing risk effectively for better development results. And what we really would like our audience to remember, also to ask themselves to the question, will we be ready when crisis strikes? And will we be ready when opportunity knocks on our door? So that's really the key issues that we really would like to remind our audience. So the value of preparation is really underscored by many different examples, and I would like to give you just a couple of them. One of them is from natural disasters. As you may have heard that a cyclone, very strong cyclone, hit India only last week, last Saturday, I believe. And it led to enormous economic damages and the damages of the infrastructure and the houses and everything. But it led to only 50, maybe less than 50 fatalities so far. A very similar cyclone in 1999 actually led to 10,000 fatalities. 10,000 people lost their lives. So what really changed in the meantime, because the impact of the magnitude of the cyclone was very similar, very comparable. And it has been emphasized that what really made the difference was a very effective pre-disaster preparation strategy by the authorities in coordination with some of the international organizations. And basically what they have done was there was an early warning system, and the authorities really went door by door and started evacuating people into shelters. And some of the people, in fact, refused to go because they said, we are okay, we can handle this, we don't have to move, but they have been forced to move out. A very similar experience has been also obtained by Bangladesh, who with a country that is really exposed to cyclones, very frequent cyclones. And as far as 1970, a cyclone hit the country, causing 300,000 fatalities. And in 2007, it was only 4,000. Of course, it is too many. As they say, one death is too many. But the difference between the fatality rate is enormous. And again, a very simple explanation, which is a nationwide program to build shelters. And it has been reported that the number of shelters in 1970 used to be only 12, and now there are more than 2,500 shelters in the country, and the number of fatalities have been reduced to 0. Of course, the shelters are not the only reason, but also an effective forecasting capacity and early warning system also helped. The second example is from global financial crises. And as you may have heard, that many emerging market countries actually have been handling the global financial crisis much better than they did in the past. And many of these countries, like Peru, experienced frequent financial crises themselves in the 1990s. But in the past 5 years, since the global crisis has started, they have handled the crisis withstand the crisis pretty well and recovered from it without a drastic fall in their growth rate and other damages. And what made the difference for them was pursuit of more prudent financial policies, an improvement in their macro performance, including controlled inflation, reduction in their current account balances and fiscal balances, an accumulation of international reserves. At the same time, the government was also able to shift the maturity and the currency structure of their debt from short-term to long-term and from foreign currency into local currency. So all these things gave the government and the country ability to be able to use counter-cyclical fiscal policies to be able to handle the crisis better. The third example is from innovation in the case of India. In India, rainfall is cited as one of the highest risks that the country faces, especially in the rural community. And many farmers, with the fear of drought, they want to accumulate their savings without using it for purchasing some intermediate products and investing it into better, perhaps higher return crops compared to low but safer crops. But in that context, they actually do not improve their income very well because they always want to play it safe with the fear of losing a lot of money in the meantime. But in the 2000s, rainfall insurance has been introduced in the country. And with that, many farmers became much less risk-averse in terms of investing their revenues into intermediate inputs like fertilizers, seeds, and pesticides, and so on, and also devoting most of their farming into higher return crops. So basically, the availability of an insurance, a risk management tool that we are going to talk about, really helped them to take opportunities, even though they may appear a bit risky. So maybe I can, with these examples, introduction of these examples, can tell you a little bit about what are we really focusing on this report. So we are trying to answer 4 questions. Basically, why is risk management important for development to begin with? Why is it relevant? And if it is relevant, how should it be conducted? And then the third question is, what kind of obstacles people may be facing in implementing an effective risk management strategy? And if so, what can be done about it in order to address these obstacles, either through public or private action? So the first question, risk management is why is risk management a powerful tool for development? Many of you would know that many of the crises that happened in the past decades are pretty much the result of mismanaged risk. So think about it in terms of economic crisis and financial crisis that many countries have experienced, natural disasters, the spread of contagious diseases that lead to enormous number of deaths whenever the populations are hit by it. Or a risk like global climate change, which is really causing a lot of an increase in the frequency and severity of the natural disasters that people are facing. All of these risks are basically the result of mismanaged or crises are the results of mismanaged risk. But at the same time, and even more importantly, sometimes missed development opportunities can occur if people do not take the necessary risk. And in this report, we really try to emphasize that risk is really inherent in the development process. So risk needs to be taken and not avoided at all cost. So effective risk management is really key to making the best out of this risk opportunity trade-off. And in many cases, failure to manage the risks effectively can actually put a lot of setbacks on the development process and traps people in poverty and make them even more exposed to shocks and make them much more fearful of taking risk to pursue opportunities that may lift them out of poverty. So why is this important? It's especially important because when we looked at data, we have seen that about 5.5 million people in the developing countries, 20% of it, like 1.2 billion people, live in extreme poverty. So they live on less than $1.25 a day. It's a very difficult number for many of us to imagine and even comprehend. How can anybody live with amount of money so small? And even more depressing is that 75% of these 5.5 billion people live on less than $4 a day. So it's a bit higher, but it's still not a number that we can imagine very easily how it happens. And it is, many studies have shown that many adverse shocks, like health shocks and economic shocks, can actually push people into poverty. And sometimes they keep them there and they cannot get out of the poverty and they get caught in the poverty trap. So basically, what we are trying to argue is that effective risk management can help people to deal with these kinds of bad shocks, negative shocks, by saving their lives, by preventing development setbacks, and unleashing the opportunities for them to develop and progress. So in this context, we see risk management having a dual objective, basically. One is to build resilience to these negative shocks and recover from it quickly, and two, boost prosperity by taking positive shocks and managing them well for development opportunities. Now, coming a little bit to the process of risk management. We basically see risk management in a dynamic process that is oversimplified, perhaps, to reflect the complexities of the world. But we see the risk management in a context where there are shocks in a world that is continuously changing and is subject to lots of uncertainty. Sorry. And those shocks can actually lead to either positive or negative outcomes, as you see on the right-hand side, as a function of people's, societies, countries' exposure to shocks, and also how they manage the risk that is involved in those shocks. And the exposure to shocks is a function of the external and internal environment that they face. So, for example, if you're a person, whether you are resilient to shocks or not maybe depends on your health, whether you are a healthy person or whether you are a very weak person with weak immune system. Or it depends on the education level of people, whether you have all the information and the tools necessary, you are aware of the tools necessary to manage the risk. External environment is also very important, so it may depend, for example, on the country that you live in a developed country or a developing country, in a poor country or reasonably advanced country. And also it depends on the availability of the instruments for risk management. So all of these are external parts of external environment. And the risk management process really is, we see it as consisting of basically two parts, preparation and coping. And preparation is really a combination of risk management tools like knowledge, protection, and insurance. And coping is everything, all the actions that people take when the risks materialize. So the whole process starts with, starts with the knowledge. So the first thing to do in the process of managing risk is to collect information, accumulate the knowledge about the nature of the shocks, the drivers of the shocks, the potential consequences of the shocks, how it can affect people, and what can be done about it. So the first thing each individual or society or a country to do to manage risk is to accumulate this knowledge base. So for example, if a family is trying to contemplate to move into a city or a country which is going to give that family better income opportunities, but at the same time that country is prone to malaria, then the first thing that they need to do is to inquire about what is malaria, how it is caused, what can be done about fighting it or preventing it. Sometimes information may just not exist. So we call these things as deep uncertainty, where no matter how much you inquire, research about, you just don't know about either the drivers or the consequences of these risks. But once you accumulate the knowledge and decide to take the risk of moving to that location, then the next thing to do is to take some protection action. Basically any action that would reduce the probability or the magnitude of the loss that people may incur by taking that action. So for example, for the malaria example again, the family may start taking malaria pills in order to keep malaria away. They may purchase some bed nets in order to keep the mosquitoes away. They may engage in some community activities to reduce the amount of water lying around that attracts the mosquitoes. So all these things are basically activities to protect yourself from the risk of malaria. But sometimes protection is not enough, of course, so the risk may still materialize. Then what you do is insure yourself against it and transfer resources from bad states to good states to bad states, and transfer resources across time, across people, and share risk. So coming back to the malaria example, it could be buying a market insurance, health insurance. Whenever the malaria happens, then you can actually activate that insurance. Or it could be self-insurance, putting the money on the bank and just accumulating it and drawing on those resources when the time comes. Or it could be informal insurance, which is more or less like social insurance, drawing on families, extended families and friends. You can go and ask money when the time hits. Or it could be public insurance, which is health insurance provided by the government. If the family is very poor and does not have the market insurance to draw on it. So regardless of all the activities that you take in order to protect yourself and prepare yourself against the risk, sometimes the risk still takes place. You catch the malaria, or a family member catches the malaria, and then you have to cope with it. So coping is all these actions that will be necessary to use the resources you have accumulated in order to deal with the consequences of it. This is a dynamic process. It's a very complicated process, but the key is that sometimes accumulating sufficient knowledge helps you to better allocate resources between protection and insurance, depending on the probability that you assigned for this event to happen, or the magnitude of the event. So sometimes it's cheaper to just protect yourself rather than investing in an insurance tool. But sometimes the frequency is so low, but the impact is so high, you need some kind of an insurance. So having the sufficient knowledge really helps you to decide which one to go. Sometimes it's a combination of the two that you have to have, depending on the event you are dealing with. And also having good preparation, either through knowledge, protection, and insurance, or a combination, reduces the magnitude of the coping you have to do. So if you actually have lots of insurance, protected yourself, lots of knowledge on what to do, then maybe the coping is not supposed to be that extreme. So sometimes if you did not prepare well, then you have to cope with extreme measures like reducing the amount and the quality of the food intake, taking the children out of school, which all of these activities have longer term implications for people's education and health. So going through that, then the next question you would ask, okay, crises are costly and the damages and all these disasters are costly, but at the same time, taking measures like this, insurance, protection, and so on, these are costly too. So then the question is, does risk management really pay off? And when we looked at data available in the literature, we have seen that indeed risk management pays off, sometimes overwhelmingly so. And especially looking at, for example, nutritional interventions in order to reduce the risk of malnutrition, or protecting yourself from measures to reduce the damage from natural disasters, or early warning systems, and vaccinations and sanitation and so on. These are, with those kinds of measures you take, you can actually obtain benefits much higher than the cost that you incur in order to manage the risk. But the world is not ideal. And obviously, there is a lot of insufficient preparation going on. Obviously, we see a lot of crises happening, costly disasters happening, sicknesses and contagions of terrible diseases happening like HIV or H1N1 flu pandemics and so on. So if risk management indeed is so great that it saves lives and averts damages and open development opportunities, and if the people really know about risk management and they understand it, then why aren't people managing the risk properly? So that's the question that we looked at most closely in this report to see what may be really driving this lack of preparation. So we have, of course, depending on the country and depending on the circumstance, the reasons may differ. But in general, the reasons are some of these obstacles that you see in there. Lack of resources and information, cognitive failures and behavioral failures, externalities and both socially and economically, and missing markets and public goods. Just to give a few examples on what each of these mean. Lack of resources and information actually prevent people from obtaining the knowledge that is necessary to learn about all these things. And so if you're a poor person who cannot go to school and obtain all this wonderful education that more other people are obtaining, then you may not be able to know all these existence of all these tools for risk management. Or even if you know them, you don't have the means to be able to acquire them because you just don't have the resources. In fact, when we looked at the data again around the world, we computed some kind of an index of preparation for risk as a function of various indicators of human capital like education and sanitation and so on, physical and financial assets like savings in the bank and access to risk management tools like credit and insurance, social support and public support measures. We saw that in many cases, the countries that have higher income also are better prepared for risk. So the dark green areas that you see are the countries that have better risk preparation. And the worst ones are the red ones where there is very little preparation. So in many cases there is a correlation, strong correlation between level of income and level of preparedness. But in some cases, even though the income level may be very similar, they may have a different color. Like in South America, some countries they have very weak preparation, but relatively similar levels of income. So something else is going on other than resources. That something else may include cognitive and behavioral failures. So even though countries, people may have the resources, they may know what to do about them. They may have the information to draw on. They may not be able to digest and interpret this information properly. So those we call cognitive failures. And sometimes they may know what to do. They may digest the information and interpret it properly, but they may not still take a risk management measure, and we call them behavioral failures. So many countries, for example, suffer from capacity constraints. So I say some of the poor countries in the world do not have the capacity to build insurance markets, credit markets. Or they know what to do, but they just don't have the technical capacity, so they need the help of somebody else. Sometimes people have a myopic way of looking at things. So for example, climate change. Many people say, well, it doesn't affect me. Maybe it will affect people hundreds years from now. Why should I care? Why should I change my way of behaving? Why should I stop driving all these wonderful sports cars that I enjoy so much, so that 50, 100 years from now, people will have a better life? So some people look at life like this. Cultural and social norms may also be a part of it. And sometimes people do not really think about rare events happening to them. They may say, oh, it would never happen to me, so why should I bother? So all these factors in a combination or separately may affect people's way of managing risk. Another factor is, even though they may cognitively, behaviorally are all right, they know what to do, they just don't have the tools to manage their risk. For example, in some countries, there may not be any well-developed derivative markets to hedge the risk. For enterprises or for banks, taking the risk without the hedging instruments may lead to disasters and crises, but they just don't have those markets missing. Sometimes public goods may be missing, like infrastructure or the rule of law. And for example, in India, this is the city of Mumbai, and the lack of public services to clean up this drainage system makes it very difficult for people to manage the flood risk. So hundreds of people have died in very frequent floods that take place in that country. And it's not because they don't know, because there have been a lot of reports written on this. And still, there is something that prevents people from managing this risk properly. Final cause could be social and economic externalities, which sometimes cause failures of collective action. So some risks, especially systemic risks, actually require a coordination, a cooperation across individuals, across countries. But when there are perverse or diverging national incentives, that people have different ways of looking at things. Sometimes exclusion of certain individuals or countries because of the reasons of religion, race, or gender. And sometimes the political economy factors, like it may be more rewarding for a government to go and save people from a disaster ex post after the disaster happens than investing all the resources ahead of time to protect and to prepare, because the benefits are not as visible as the outcomes of ex post saving of these people. In fact, when you look at the data again, the donor, only 3.6% of the total donor resources allocated to natural disasters is spent on preparation and prevention, and the rest of it all goes to emergency response or reconstruction. So there is some preference towards ex post rather than ex ante preparation. Trying to hurry up a little bit. All this is to say that looking at risks in isolation is not really sufficient. We also need to look at what are the obstacles to these risk management and what are the trade-offs that are involved in across risks and risk management. And those trade-offs and obstacles need to be addressed by public and private action. So what can be done? We say that in our report, this is one of our key recommendations, that risk management requires shared responsibility and action at every level of the society. So we have a holistic approach of looking at things. So the idea is that individuals may be capable of addressing certain types of risks themselves on their own, but they are inherently unequipped to deal with large shocks, like the head of a household falling ill, systemic shocks like big natural hazards, or multiple shocks that either come simultaneously or one after the other, like in Japan, an earthquake followed by a tsunami, which has been followed by a nuclear disaster. So these are very big risks for individuals or individual countries to handle on their own. But people can still manage risks sufficiently, effectively, if they actually share risk and risk management with others. And this is basically how we look at it, that we put people at the center and we consider all the economic and social systems ranging from household to the community to enterprise and financial system, the state and even the international community as part of a system or framework that help people manage risk. And all of them do in various different ways, but they complement each other doing it. So in a very complicated looking chart, what I want to mention is that people's risk management can be first helped by the household. Households are usually the first instant of support through family ties, by sharing, pooling the resources together, and protecting their members, the ill, the child, and the sick. But sometimes they may not actually do a very good job, especially if there is discrimination within the family, across the old, across women, for example. Or if the households are not having a very adequate access to markets or other families or other communities. The communities then come in order to provide informal type of risk-sharing arrangements. So by communities, we mean extended families and friends and so on. And they are usually good at helping people to manage idiosyncratic risks, or they can also manage a systemic risk by pooling resources together. But usually communities are also not very sufficient to deal with big, large shocks, and especially when preparation requires a long term of investment. Enterprise sector provides jobs and income, a stable and growing levels of income to people, allow them to innovate and take the positive side of shocks. But sometimes they may not be able to do so because the enterprise sector is a formal sector. And many developing countries actually have people employed as self-employed. So they don't have the opportunity to share risks. And sometimes enterprises are not very good at providing protection to people and to the environment, like we have seen in Bangladesh, collapse of the factory and leading to the death of 1,100 or so people, or the oil spill in the ocean. Financial system provides tools for risk management, like insurance and credit and savings, but only to the extent that it manages the risks that it takes and retains properly. And if it does not do so, then the financial crisis results and they cannot really support the people's risk management. So all these systems can do a very good job in supporting people's risk management, but whenever there are these weaknesses that I have mentioned, the state has a role to play. And sometimes they can directly provide people ways to support their risk management through social protection, old age, or unemployment insurance or health insurance. And sometimes they do this very indirectly by providing an enabling environment for these other systems, household, communities, financial system, and so on, to help people's risk management. So there is an indirect and direct function that they perform. Of course, states have frequent failures too, either because of capacity constraints, because risks are too large for them, or because they don't have very good governance and they don't take very good decisions to protect their own people. And sometimes risks are just cross-border. One country cannot do a lot in order to save itself from climate change or other risks like that, or pandemics. In that case, we have the international community that comes in. An international community provides resources and expertise. It provides some tools for coordination for countries to come together and help implement rules that protect people. I'm going to go this very fast because of the interest of time, but all these things that I mentioned, they are already here, and I would really invite you to take a look at the report, which basically studies all these individual systems like household, communities, financial system, enterprise system, and the macroeconomy, providing all these supports to risk management to people, and whenever they do not, then how the system can contribute. So again, please don't even attempt to read this. This is a box in our report that basically provides all these policy recommendations of what the state can do or public policy can do in order to help each of these economic and social systems to help people. The underlying common element in all that is that we say that these risk management strategies need to be implemented in a strategic, systematic, proactive, and integrated fashion in order to basically optimize their effectiveness. And in order to achieve this, we recommend formation of a national risk board. And this national risk board can be established to incorporate risk management into the development agenda. And this kind of formation of a national risk board will involve a fundamental change in the way that many governments do business. And that basically means to take into account really seriously the change and uncertainty into their decision making and policy making. So the National Risk Board, we recommend basically is motivated by most of the time lack of coordination across different policy stakeholders in managing the risk. And that usually leads to insufficient, inadequate, inefficient use of very scarce resources. So we say that the National Risk Board should be formed either as a new agency that is created out of nothing, or by reforming some of the existing agencies. So depending on the context of the country, it may be different. But the idea is that this board that is formed, either as a new agency or from other agencies, considers risks, synergies, trade-offs across risks and address them in differing contexts. So they prioritize across various different risks. This is especially important because many risks are interconnected. So consider, for example, the example of and having an advisory role and implementation role can be obtained by a different combination. Sorry. So there are actually examples of this. This is not something that we propose out of an empty box. In fact, there are some countries like Singapore, Netherlands, and UK which have a national risk board of some type. They have different kinds of elements in it which make all of them unique. And there are some developing countries that are following these examples, like Morocco, Mexico, Jamaica, and even Mali and Rwanda, which are countries with fragilities and conflict. So we throw this recommendation into our audience to say that sometimes adopting a national risk board like this can really help to look at risk management in an integrated fashion, in a holistic fashion, taking into account all the trade-offs and synergies into account. Then we asked the question, can this kind of a national risk board also be applied at the global context by forming an international risk board? Now I'm finishing up. This is my last slide, and I'm going to let Martin and Cesar to present in more detail the financial sector and macro elements. And if we have time, I will also tell you a little bit more about the international community. But we finished our report by providing 5 key principles of public action that are really important in forming the risk management policies. The first, they sound a little bit straightforward and obvious, but they are not. The first one is do not generate uncertainty or additional risks. What we mean by this is that sometimes the governments take certain policy actions without meaning anything bad, but they may have unintended consequences. For example, the example of the European currency crisis that I just mentioned, or the global financial crisis. All the governments, central banks came together and injected all that liquidity and the capital into banking system to resolve the financial crisis. But nobody really thought about what it might do into the fiscal budgets. And so when that happened, the fiscal imbalances started really getting worse and worse, leading to sovereign crisis in Europe and also some significant problems in the US, as you have seen. The government shut down, only to open up recently, avoiding a big crisis that probably could have followed. So doing some policies really require policymakers to think about the unintended consequences of what they may be doing and trying to minimize these kind of uncertainties and risks. Second is providing the right incentives. As I said, we have this holistic approach where we say risk management is a shared responsibility for people. But this should not be taken to say individuals should leave risk management to others, and they should do whatever they can in order to manage the risks that they can manage. So risks should be managed at the lowest level that is capable of being managed at that level. And that means that the government's policies need to provide some right incentives to people, encouraging them to prepare while relying on the government or others whenever they cannot manage those risks themselves. Keep a long-run perspective, basically through certain institutional mechanisms that transcend political cycles. So that means that governments should not only do things that are right for their own election results, but do things that would also help the country to do better over the long term. Promote flexibility within a predictable framework. We show many examples of flexibility helping to absorb shocks. Whenever there is, for example, flexible exchange rate risk policies may help countries to deal better with labor shocks or with economic crises or even natural crises. Cesar is going to tell you a little bit more about that. So flexibility is always useful. To have it in a system or in an individual. That also means individuals being more diverse in terms of education and capabilities and so on. And finally, protect the vulnerable is a key element of risk management, especially poor countries where they cannot do it on their own. But again, this should be done in a way to encourage self-reliance and also with an eye on making sure that fiscal sustainability is maintained. By putting a lot of money into the poor, the governments should also make sure that they have enough money for the future so that they can do counter-cyclical policies. So I'm going to stop there with a little cartoon that basically summarizes our report. So to pursue opportunity, people must confront risk. They should not avoid it at all costs. But they don't face only one risk, but many of them. And often they are burdened with all these obstacles to manage them. And sharing risk with others can overcome these obstacles through the family, community, enterprises, banks, government, and even the international community. And by doing that, they can actually provide a collective action and provide the institutions that they can help them manage the risk. And provide a tool for development in the road to prosperity and resilience. I know this is sort of a fairy tale kind of looking thing, but it really tries to summarize all the elements, key elements that I have just described to you. So with apologies for keeping it very, very long, I don't know how much I talked, but I will leave it now to Cesar and to Martin to tell you more about financial sector and macro. And if you really have time, then I will talk about the international. Thank you so much for your patience.
In terms of the format, we'll take questions at the end of all three presentations. So thank you again for your interest in the World Development Report 2014. I will speak to specifically on Chapter 6 on the role of the financial system in risk management. Let me start with trying to give you some motivation on how the financial system can help people manage risk. It can help people ensure their livelihoods. It can help them grow their savings and pursue opportunity with greater flexibility. And if everything goes well, people are happy about finance, such as these people in rural China receiving a payout from health insurance. But if the financial system mismanages the risk that it retains during while conducting financial intermediation, it can propagate shocks to people. People can lose access to their deposits, or they can lose their deposits altogether. And because of its systemic importance, financial system can really take the whole economy down if it collapses. So with that motivation, I would like to give you an outline of my talk. I will take no more than 15 minutes. I will talk on the topic of financial inclusion, financial stability, then discuss the tension between how we can enhance financial inclusion and maintain financial stability. Lastly, I will propose some reforms of public institutions and financial policy that can produce hopefully better outcomes in the financial sector going ahead. So we argue in the report that financial tools can improve resilience and available opportunities. Let me give you some examples. Payment and foreign exchange services can help people transfer remittances from across the world efficiently and securely, and they can also connect consumers and enterprises more efficiently to markets. Saving instruments, bank deposits, liquid securities can help people build up buffers for rainy days, and self-insure credit such as education loans, can help people acquire human capital and become more flexible in the labor market. Debt and equity investment can help people diversify their wealth and protect against concentrated business risk. And market insurance can help people transfer resources from from good states to bad states of nature, including the hedging instruments. And finally, public trading of assets reveals important information that the private sector, people and enterprises can, and also states, can use in decision making on consumption and investment. So if financial tools are so helpful, are they actually used in practice? I'll focus on the example of savings. These are some summarized data from the Global Findex of the World Bank. I have data on low income, middle income and high income countries. The blue color shows the proportion of people that save with formal financial services. The red color shows the proportion of people that save using informal financial tools. And the green color shows the proportion of people that do not save at all. Surprisingly, I would say even in high-income countries, about 40% of people do not save at all. And this proportion is much higher, around 70% in developing economies, middle-income and low-income countries. So there's a lot of room for improvement. So what are the obstacles that are holding back broader financial inclusion and use of financial tools? There are supply-side constraints. For example, the financial system structure usually concentrates in banks, which limits the provision of other financial tools such as insurance. There's often lacking competition among banks and more importantly among banks and non-banks in the common product space. And incentives in financial market are mostly or are a lot of times driven by short-term profit maximization. Constraints are also on the demand side. People often complain they don't have money or resources to work with and use financial tools. But we know from the diaries of the poor that even the poorest of the poor are using very sophisticated financial arrangements to manage their finances. Or they just simply, people complain that banks are too far to access of financial institutions. Cost could be another obstacle that could be because of small scales of the markets oftentimes. Mistrust in financial institutions due to previous bad experience, such as pyramid schemes. Or people just choose to stay informal. One way how to formalize the economy is to involve people in informal transactions through the financial sector, and they might not want to do that. Or due to low financial literacy, people just don't understand the usefulness of financial tools. But political economic constraints and policy pitfalls are also responsible for some of the suboptimal outcomes concerning financial inclusion. For example, misallocation of credit due to political economic factors and lobbying, as described in Raddatz and Brown, for example, and direct interventions using guarantees and subsidies can often distort the incentives of people and the financial system to manage risk responsibly. So what is the public policy that can help us overcome these obstacles and produce better outcomes in terms of financial inclusion? We argue that policymakers should use direct interventions sparingly, and such as subsidies and guarantees, and focus mainly the direct interventions on overcoming obstacles of small scale of markets, inadequate infrastructure, and low financial literacy. I'll give you here an example of India's government to person payments. It means transfers and payouts of social assistance to people through an AGA program that facilitated involvement of people in using electronic payments and try to overcome the small scale of the market problem. We argue that policymakers should really focus on the indirect interventions through regulations to improve consumer protection, increase competition among financial firms, and promote useful financial innovation. An example of such regulation is the regulatory framework that underpin the development of Kenya's M-Pesa system, which is a mobile saving and payment product. Lastly, policymakers cannot do reforms and design them blindly. They need to learn about the situation, So really collecting regularly data that can help policymakers assess where the biggest gaps in financial inclusion are, and how they can evaluate and learn from previous reforms to design the next reform that they will implement better or drop those that are not working is very important. An example is Mexico's data collection reform focused on financial inclusion. This cartoon brings me to my next topic. Even if financial tools are working fine and people are including in using them, still if financial system fails to manage the risks that it retains, it can propagate negative shocks to people, cause major inconveniences. And this system-wide risk or systemic risk is the main topic of the financial stability part that I will talk about. So let me speak about the origins of the systemic risk in finance. Systemic risk can build up over the time dimension of a financial cycle through excessive booms that are followed by pronounced bust in credit provision. And this is really a primary concern for the policymakers and the private sector as well. And sometimes these busts in credit are so bad that we talk about banking crisis or financial crisis in general. Let me give you a few examples. Banking crisis in Colombia, Tunisia, Thailand, and Ukraine were really preceded by excessive growth of credit, and you can see the magnitudes. But systemic risk has also a cross-sectional dimension that stems from interconnectedness of financial institutions that can transform one failing institution or the risk of one failing institution into a systemic risk. And interconnectedness is not only within the national borders, it can be across countries. And an example of such a systemic event was the withdrawal of liquidity by parent banks in 2009 from Southeastern Europe that was only contained through a public-private partnership under the Vienna Initiative. So what can we do with public policy to improve systemic risk management? Good practice is that prudential policy that focuses on systemic risk management is implemented by macroprudential policy committees, such as the one of the Bank of England. Policymakers, to monitor and assess risk, should really focus on simple and robust indicators of systemic risk, such as New Zealand does, and calibrate macroprudential tools to the specifics of the country. It doesn't mean to necessarily to use one tool. For example, countries like Brazil, Turkey, and China use the whole range of tools to really capture the specifics that I need to address within the country context. We argue that, especially in tranquil periods, policymakers need to devote resources and time to crisis preparedness. And that could be in the form of improving the legislative frameworks, such as financial stability laws, or really going through the drills of war games and crisis simulation exercises to really build up soft skills, improve coordination, and build flexible institutions for better coping with crises. Important aspect is also reduction of regulatory uncertainty, and especially in the context of regulatory capture, and that was illustrated in several studies before and during the financial crisis. So let me now speak briefly about the tension between how we can advance financial inclusion and how we can maintain financial stability at the same time. And you can see the tension in the face of real-life policymaker, Mr. Paulson, that just received a new financial regulatory reform to contain and better manage systemic risk, but he is afraid of stifling creativity of the financial system that is going wild behind him. So the tension between financial inclusion and financial stability can arise because financial inclusion on one hand can help enhance financial stability. For example, if more people save, use saving products, the deposit base, the financing deposit base of the bank becomes more diversified and more resilient in times of stress. But at the same time, financial stability can endanger, financial inclusion can endanger financial stability if it's excessive. An example is the consumer credit growth in Russia over 2003-2008, where the excessive credit growth left people with a large financial burden that limited their spending even on basic necessities when the market condition deteriorated. Also, taking it a little bit broadly, financial system can can go into unstable periods if it does a little bit, if it does more than it can handle, meaning going beyond its financial feasibility frontier. So lastly, let me talk about what we can do with public policy to achieve better outcomes in the financial sector in the years forward. We argue that really successful financial policy needs to consider trade-offs and synergies in finance. We think that the useful way how to do it is through national financial sector strategies that really set the goals, the development goals, with a view to the systemic risk that is associated with achieving those goals, and at the same time communicate the risk appetite of the country in the financial sector. However, when we look at the empirical evidence and we review some 60 to 70 strategies of different countries, we see that the trade-off between financial development and systemic risk management is rarely discussed. This is a little bit curious because 64% of countries are committing to achieving both goals in their strategy. So to improve on that process and have more robust financial strategies and more consistent policies going ahead, we recommend that countries establish financial policy committees with an effective governance structure that brings together policy, science, and the industry to really improve coordination and produce balanced policies that will be sustainable in the medium to long term. However, alternatives can work as well. For example, in Malaysia, the central bank takes the lead in engaging all the stakeholders in Malaysia, like Ministry of Finance, the private sector, and preparing a national financial sector strategy. So let me just conclude. We still observe significant gaps in financial inclusion, and even in advanced countries, and this doesn't concern only credit. We have to think more broadly. It's also savings, insurance, electronic payments, capital market instruments. We've learned the hard way that mismanaged systemic risk can really result in costly crises. But if we want to really fulfill both objectives of financial inclusion and financial stability, it is a complex task. And it is a complex task because of various policy trade-offs. To handle these complex tasks in a better way and with better outcomes in the future, we recommend that countries establish financial policy committees to adequately address these trade-offs and exploit synergies when they're formulating public policy. Thank you for your attention. I'll give the floor to Cesar now.
Well, I mean, thanks for the invitation to come here to present a chapter of the World Development Report. Sometimes it's difficult to talk after my two colleagues have talked because, I know that time is pressing and attention may be flailing, and I'm still a bit under the weather, so you're going to apologize for the voice. It's not that I have a sexy voice, I'm just sick. I asked somebody in the lobby of the hotel if he can tell me where I can cure this, and he told me Pivo Bar, so I guess that means pharmacy in Czech. But well, I'm going to go to more serious issues right now. And what we do here is basically try to see why or how macroeconomic management can help people to manage risks. Why is macroeconomic risk management important? The macroeconomy is basically the platform where economic decisions are taken, all economic activity and economic activities undertaken in general. From, if you think on the perspective of the households, consumption and savings decisions are taken there. Look at the enterprises, investment and production activities. And if we think about what Martin just said, which is the financial sector, all the borrowing and lending decisions. So a sound macroeconomic management, basically what's going to give individuals under supporting systems, which Inci basically summarized, is going to give them an enabling environment, enabling environment for them to undertake their own risk management and also to plan long term. So why macroeconomic risk management is important, and I'll continue with this, it is because individuals face different types of risks. Some risks they are equipped to manage on their own, and some they are not. And that, of course, will depend on the nature of the shocks, or will depend on the obstacles or distortions that they face in order that prevent them from managing them successfully. And in this context, in the context of the macroeconomy, the government plays a unique function, which is the function of conducting macroeconomic policy. So basically, this chapter of the report deals with aggregate shocks, as you can see when you compare the size of the shocks with the size of our salaries. Macroeconomic policy in this context, or in the context of what we see in this report, has a triple role. The first role would be to manage aggregate shocks through the design of rules and institutions of macroeconomic policies. Think about targets on structural budget balances in the case of fiscal policy, or inflation targeting regimes in the case of monetary policy, or having to choose a specific exchange rate regime. The second role would be try to facilitate the development of risk-sharing mechanisms. And that's basically because sound macroeconomic management will foster the development of local currency securities markets and also foster long-term contracting. And the third role, it has to do a little bit with what Inci was talking about, generating unnecessary risks. Macroeconomic policy has to be conducted in such a way that it doesn't become a source of aggregate shocks. So the presentation, and I'll try to keep it short, will have two parts. The first part will be basically how can macroeconomic policies foster resilience and prosperity. And the second part will talk a little bit of what policies can best contribute to risk management. So the first pillar in how can macro policies contribute to foster resilience and prosperity is going to be achieving macro stability. Coming from a country like my country, Peru, which has fought a lot of bouts of high inflation and sharp recessions, we know that macroeconomic stability is pretty important. If you think about it, in the middle of the 80s, in the second half of the 80s, when Peru was going through 3-digit inflation or even 4-digit annual inflation, nobody was thinking about taking, or there was no financial institution that could give you a mortgage credit, right? I mean, that would be suicidal. So macroeconomic stability is important, and it's important because it has harmful effects. But the harmful effects are not the ones that are driven by moderate fluctuations that we observe in business cycle. These harmful effects are basically driven by abrupt ups and downs in economic activity, or abrupt swings, meaning big booms and big busts, and also from high inflation. And I mean, I'm presenting here two pieces of information of why, or of evidence of why macroeconomic volatility is so important. Achieving macro stability is important because the harmful effects of volatility are percolate throughout the entire economy, and you can see through higher unemployment, to interruption of credit, through the deferment of investment plans, and of course it affects the long-term growth of the economy. What you see in the first graph is basically a negative association between the volatility of real GDP per capita and the growth rate of real GDP per capita. But at the same time, it not only has a negative effect on growth, and there are empirical research that shows econometrically that an increase in volatility from normal to crisis times would reduce the growth per capita by 2.2 percentage points. It also affects the poor, and it affects it disproportionately. And what the second graph shows is that what you observe here, which is that, the increase in inequality during bad times, during sharp recessions, is not offset by the reduction in inequality during good times. So that means that these booms and busts that we observe in economic activity can indeed have a permanent effect on income inequality. The second reason how macro policies can foster resilience and prosperity is through the creation of some fiscal space. So we can fund either short-term coping policies or long-term public spending or public investment programs. And why is this important? Because as we said before, crisis can have an impact on economic growth. And it also can have an impact on the income and welfare of the poor. And the problem is, at least in developing countries, we see that a lot, is that crisis leads to an interruption or a deterioration in the provision of essential public goods and services. And this happens a lot in countries that during downturns, they are forced to undertake drastic cuts in expenditure. I can give you many examples of that. I mean, being in Latin America and living during those times, the evidence basically tells you that in the late 80s to the early 90s, half of the fiscal adjustment during the downturn was basically a cut in infrastructure investment. You have a lot of evidence in the case of Middle Eastern and North African countries that there's a drastic cut also in social security spending after crisis. Or there's evidence about some Eastern European countries, or evidence about some East Asian countries, poor East Asian countries, where education budgets are reduced after a crisis. So it's very important for the government to try to be prudent in good times and try to build buffers in order to fund short-term policies or long-term programs to avoid costly coping. The second part of the talk is what policies can best contribute to risk management. So I'm going to talk about three different areas that we somehow highlight within the report. The first is having a transparent and credible monetary policy. Over the last 20, 25 years, monetary policy worldwide has had a stellar record. If you think about it, if one thinks about it and looks at the evidence, they have been able to successfully bring down inflation. Between 1991 and 1994, more or less 34, 35 countries used to have an annual inflation rate greater than 50%. By the end of the 2000s, there was only one country in the world with such a high inflation rate, and that country in the world was Zimbabwe. So where does this success lie? Where are the roots of this success? What can explain the success of monetary policy? The answer seems a little bit simplistic, but it's true, which is basically trying to adopt a monetary policy framework that creates incentives for price stability. And that basically lies on solid institutional underpinnings, which is one, central banks have a clear mandate. The mandate is basically to keep inflation low and stable. Two, they have to be independent. They have to be an autonomous central bank, which we think is normal under several circumstances in several countries, but that's not true in others. And I'm sure that the Argentinians can say something about that. What does an autonomous central bank mean? That they have to be free from political interference and also have being independent to set a policy tool that allows them to achieve their goals. And third, accountability. Accountability which basically relies on the central bank being transparent and communicating their strategy, and will allow them to somehow achieve their goals. The monetary policy framework that emerging markets had in place over the last 5 to 10 years has been put to test. And one big test was the recent global financial crisis. And this is where we see that there is a breaking pattern from history. If we look at the first graph, we have two density functions. The darker one is the density function for the current 2008-2009 crisis. The gray one is for the East Asian crisis and the devaluation of the ruble, of the Russian ruble. So what we have here is basically that if you look at this graph, in times of crisis, central banks in emerging markets have been more able, or have been more frequently, they have been able to reduce policy rates. Sorry, this is the density function of policy rate changes. And if we look at the picture when we compare advanced and emerging markets during the current crisis, we observe that, of course, most of the advanced economies are used to conduct counter-cyclical policies during recessions. But we see now that a bigger chunk of emerging markets are able to do that. No? The second pillar of how macro policies contribute best to risk management is having flexible exchange rate regimes. And the experience in emerging markets trying to adopt these regimes is that they have been effective shock absorbers. Developing countries with floating rates have been able to lower output costs or to adjust rapidly in case of a deterioration in terms of trade, natural hazards, and shocks producing either internal or external balances. I'm not going to go through the entire explanation for time's sake, but you're welcome to read those highlights in the report. And the third element in the contribution of macro policies is governments managing to conduct counter-cyclical and sustainable fiscal policy. Fiscal policy doesn't have the track record that monetary policy has shown over the last 15 to 25 years. And it's kind of like easy to say why. Fiscal policy tends to be more complex. And it's not only because of the multiplicity of goals and instruments, no? But also because it's immersed in the political process. So political factors are going to be obstacles to an efficient fiscal risk management. And it's one of the reasons, among others, of course, where developing countries have shown typically a pro-cyclical bias in fiscal policy. So during downturns, governments tend to either increase taxes or cut spending, basically deepening the recession. However, there has been, over the last 10, 15 years, an institutional push in emerging markets, and an institutional push that has put a premium on fiscal transparency and fiscal discipline. And also the sound macro financial management and a very efficient debt management has allowed them to somehow reduce currency risks, interest rate risks, and refinancing risks, and have permitted the authorities to somehow build buffers in good times. So what we observe, at least in developing countries, is that some of them are graduating from pro-cyclicality. For instance, when we look at this map, the areas in red shows well, first of all, the map shows the evolution of fiscal policy between 1960, 1999, and during the last decade. We want to see whether there was a change in cyclical stance. So the countries that have the red color are the countries that are always pro-cyclical, that countries that have the dark green color always counter-cyclical, and the ones that we were interested in looking at were the ones with light green. The ones in light green basically tell me that in the first period they were pro-cyclical, and now they became counter-cyclical. The interesting fact that we get from this map is basically that this institutional push towards more discipline and towards more transparency have led to 1/3 of developing countries to be able now to conduct fiscal policy, counter-cyclical fiscal policy. And I'm going to try to finish soon. And basically, what are the takeaways of the chapter? The takeaways of the chapter is basically that we need to develop institutional capacity to produce credible, transparent, and sustainable policies. That preparation is necessary, that policymakers need to stop reacting only or coping only, be crisis fighters, to be more active risk managers. And there's one more lesson to all policymakers too, which is even if your framework was tested once and that test was successful, you don't have to fall into complacency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cesar and Martin. And thank you very much for your patience and listening to us without, we didn't really let you ask any questions in between. I was going to actually present another economic system, which is the international community, and what it is role in managing risk and supporting countries that either because of their capacity constraints or because the risks they are dealing with are cross-border, that they need the international community's support. But I think in the interest of the time, and also we let you sit and listen to all these material without letting you ask any questions, I think I would like to actually open the floor for discussions and let you ask any questions that you may have, either on the general key messages of the report, or to Cesar and Martin for financial and macroeconomic systems. And if you have no questions, then I will go and continue, but I will leave it to you. Okay, so we are at your disposal. Please have any questions that you may have. Any questions? Everything was so clear, or everything was so easy to follow, or any interest in terms of going into more details on any part of the presentation?
I have just a comment. It's hard to believe that even one-third. It's hard to believe that even one-third of the countries have counter-cyclical fiscal policy. It's my impression that this, as you mentioned, political process is so much involved there that it's really difficult to have serious counter-cyclical policy. So you just do it binary 0-1. But if you look deeper, I guess you can hardly find any country which have serious counter-cyclical, or which prepared very well in the time of, in good times for something bad to come. Is there any example of such country? Probably exception proving the rules.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think if I have to somehow relabel a little bit what you just told me, is that everybody's counter-cyclical when times are bad, right? The problem is what happens when the party is going and times are good. And the best example of that, maybe Martin can talk a little bit about that, is the financial system, no? When basically you hear managers saying, I mean, I'm gonna party until the music is off, right? It's true. I mean, if you look at, I would say that if you look at a country like Chile, Chile is a good example of doing counter-cyclical policy both in good times and bad times. They have already mechanisms of savings. Even they have within that saving mechanism, they have one of the variables that within that saving mechanism is copper prices, right? I mean, it's a huge copper exporter. Whenever the international price of copper is way too high, you know, it's not like Latin America in the 50s where you're gonna basically spend all the money. No, they will save it. So I would say that that country is a very good sample of
There is a just exception which proves the rule. I would say. What is the second one?
a second example. Norway. Norway is another good example of that. I mean, countries. I mean, if you want to characterize some of the countries that are doing, yeah. I mean, but well, at least the Chileans are not Scandinavians, but. I mean, Scandinavian countries would be a broad example, but then somebody would say maybe it's cultural, maybe it has something to do with the Scandinavians, like Acemoglu said. But I would say Chile. Peru is trying to do that. Peru is trying to put limits on spending. And I think it's because at least some of the South American countries have lived the consequences of deep crisis, where they have leaner states and where they're trying to somehow limit spending in good times.
If I may add, actually, some countries basically try to balance the long-term structural fiscal deficits rather than short-term. You have examples of that. I think Norway is one of them. Chile and Norway are one of them. That allows the flexibility to be able to support the economy whenever it is needed, while you have you do not get punished by the market by deviating from the deficit. And an additional thing that I wanted to mention is, even during the global crisis, all the countries in the advanced world started following more supportive fiscal and economic policies in order to dampen the impact that the financial crisis had on the economies. Of course, very quickly they ran out of money because they didn't have a lot of buffers, and that's really, and they started cutting some of the social security benefits, which then led to this social crisis that I was talking about, with the unemployment rate and people who are really in the greatest need. Suddenly the social security spending is cut. So I think that emphasized the importance for not only for advanced countries but for the developing countries really to develop, implement counter-cyclical policies and put whatever they can in good times so that they can draw on it in better times.
Maybe let me also add to this question. I think also the question is to what extent the fiscal cycle is driven just by automatic stabilizers, and to what extent you use discretionary fiscal policy, especially for the big recessions such as crises. And it also comes to the fact that, and this is discussed in Cesar's chapter, not only how you manage the party that is going on, but also what you commit during that party that you will do in the downturn. All these contingent liabilities that are being promised, not delivered, or they are breaking states' budgets.
Either as a follow-up or other parts of the chapters or presentations. Yeah.
It's about the same map. It's about the same map which Kresha told about. Are you sure that USA is counter-cyclical and China is pro-cyclical? You are really think so? USA and China. USA is green, China is red. From my point of view, I read about 1,000 papers about it. It's absolutely vice versa. China, it was the country which helped us in this crisis. USA created this crisis. What you are talking about?
Okay, so let me give you a more nuanced interpretation of what is there. And what we have there is basically one part of government spending, which is consumption. The problem is that we don't have in data, I mean, for the entire cross-section on public investment. We had some data for China on public investment. We did those regressions, and China shows counter-cyclicality. But the problem is, again, for the sake of comparison, I cannot put some countries consumption plus investment, other countries consumption only, etc., etc. But if you look at that, if you look at one of the boxes, we argue that China behaved counter-cyclically and through massive investment programs. So that's basically what I'm trying to tell you is, there's a little bit in the details on how the map was constructed that according to your interpretation could seem misleading. But it's basically, it's a very focused analysis on government consumption. But when you put investment into the equation, the situation changes. And if you think about it, I mean, during the last crisis, was it government consumption, the expansion in China? No, it was investment. Massive investment in capacity.
Your presentations were like very interesting, but I would like to know like the key action steps that the World Bank takes in order to have the world more prepared for these risks. Because like somehow I would like to know if there will be just the lobbying with the policymakers or like this kind of stuff.
Okay, maybe I should take it. So your question basically is what is the next step in terms of this report's implications and where do we go from here? Just well, there are two things actually. I don't know if you have heard about the World Bank moving in the direction of more achieving two basic goals. One is to eliminate poverty, extreme poverty, and two, boost shared prosperity by increasing the income growth of the 40%, bottom 40%, 40% of the developing country populations. So the World Bank's new strategy is to achieve these goals by 2030, if I recall correctly. Now, what we are saying in this report is that risk management is key to development, not only by increasing the resilience of the populations to negative shocks, but also by allowing, through effective risk management, by allowing countries to pursue development opportunities. So you can, in fact, map these two objectives of risk management almost directly to the goals of the World Bank in terms of reducing extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. Our management is actually following this very closely, and we are in the stage of operationalizing the implications of the recommendations of this report, not only by changing the way that the institution approaches risk itself, in other words, not being too risk averse, but being willing to take risks whenever there are positive development opportunities around the world, and two, how we can help by using the implications and the recommendations of this report, how we can help the countries to improve their or strengthen their risk management capacities. And the second one we are trying to do through, of course, a variety of different tools by providing knowledge, disseminating knowledge across countries, by learning from the positive, good experiences of some countries and sharing it with countries that really need them and do not have the techniques. By providing capacity building assistance. So we have a big technical assistance capacity building program through which we would be able to help countries to put in place risk management capacities along with the recommendations of our report. And also a third element is the bank has these programs, economic programs and financing that it provides to certain countries through country partnership frameworks, which is being reformed at the moment and refined along with the new goals of the institution. And we are pushing as the World Development Report team to take risk and uncertainty very seriously in the context of these partnership strategies. In other words, don't take things as if they are all certain, but also pay attention to uncertainties and risks that each country faces and consider them in an integrated fashion by looking at risks all together and trying to see how they link to each other and how they can be best managed effectively. So the implications of the report is being very much going to be taken to the ground, if I can say so. And we have a set of colleagues in the bank currently who are going to be involved in operationalizing and translating all the recommendations into the bank's own operations. Do you want to add anything?
Maybe some concrete examples. We believe that we will try to increase the appetite for countries to really step back and take a holistic view at how they manage all the risks and within the constraint of their resources and different country specifics through dissemination of the report. But these are some of the countries are actually thinking about it already, and Inci mentioned some examples. For example, Morocco was already looking at integrating the risk management of various natural hazards, but now realize that they are not covering enough of social and economic risk. So with the World Bank teams, they are trying to develop a broader framework for really holistic risk management and prioritize the risks that are most relevant for the country. Then the interesting question is, as Inci mentioned, the idea of international risk board. You're probably familiar with institutions such as World Economic Forum and Copenhagen Consensus that are kind of trying to push in that direction. But the problem is with sometimes with those institutions that they lack really policy relevance and legitimacy. So really having them or their recommendations bite in and change policy making in different countries is a difficult task for now.
May I ask a question? What would your thinking be? Because we are trying to also get some feedback on some of the recommendations and the thoughts that we have put into in this report. And one of them was this translating a similar recommendation to National Risk Board into international agenda. And if I had talked about the international community, I was going to be talking about this a bit in more detail. But the idea is really to form a committee like International Risk Board, which can look at a variety of different global risks like climate change, pandemic risks, global financial crisis, global economic crisis, the crisis that is facing fragile and conflict states like in Syria and the region, Middle East region, or cyber attacks, or a meteor hitting the earth. So all these things are really global risks where national economies themselves and the governments cannot really handle on their own. So the idea then is to bring countries together and try to assess these type of risks, and how can they do that without putting their hats of national economies on and trying to see these risks from their own nationalistic perspectives. So the idea of an international risk board really is to bring people together from various different countries, having representation of both the developing, emerging, and advanced countries, and also having representation of countries that most contribute a problem and the countries that are most affected by those problems. In addition, bringing global media, global scientific community, and global civil societies and private sector institutions together, and assess these risks in a very collegial way to figure out what are the most highest priority risks that the global system and the international community should be worried about, and what can be done about this. In a similar way that we have been suggesting to National Risk Board to put the trade-offs, synergies, complementarities, and try to prioritize across all these risks that I mentioned, and find ways to manage them. And I would be very interested in hearing your feedback on, is this a totally rosy, dream-like recommendation that we expect? Is it very optimistic, or is there some merit to doing something like this? So I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts about it. Yes, please.
As you mentioned, these various various risk management levels like households and community. This goes far beyond the international level. This is not just a couple of countries. If we are talking about global warming or some truly global crisis. What is going to be the lever? How can you make the countries to actually act by your recommendations or by the best policy available?
This was the question. You are just increasing.
if I understood correctly, your reply is it sounds a bit unrealistic, and how would you achieve that? Is that what you?
Yeah, right. I mean, even like all or majority of these things, so we have seen in the presentation, seem very, very simple and maybe even say quite obvious at the first sight, and still, I mean, they aren't implemented worldwide. So what's the, maybe it's just my not fully understanding of the World Bank role, but I mean, is there any lever or any way how you can make the countries to act in the way you recommend them to? Thank you.
Very good question, actually. One thing that we have been recommending in the international community chapter was that for those types of risks, which are very difficult to address, like climate change and resource degradation and so on, one of the key reasons it's not being addressed is because those risks affect everybody, but it affects some countries much more seriously than others. And so the interests of different national governments are very different. So, for example, US may not be as badly affected by climate change, even though it is too, compared to a developing country like Maldives, which is supposed to disappear if the climate change and global warming continues at its right speed, at current speed. The country is going to disappear out of existence. So some countries care a lot about it, some countries couldn't care less, not only because they are not affected as much, and two, even if they are affected, they have the tools and resources to deal with it to some extent. So what we were suggesting in the report was for risks like these, we can, the international community can support incremental actions, incremental deals, by helping to form a coalition of the willing. So bringing countries that are really hoping to create a solution out of this, and not only including countries that are being affected by it, but also countries that are really causing the problem. And together with the help of the global scientific community, the civil society, which can do wonders, to analyze and convince people through advocacy, through risk awareness, education, and knowledge. And basically take actions, maybe one by one, but take actions that can lead to an outcome, positive outcome, and create a motivation for going for the next step. And you may see this as a dream kind of approach, but it has been done. In fact, one good example that we cite in the report is the Montreal Protocol, which basically dealt with the ozone layer, damage to the ozone layer. And this Montreal Protocol started with only 24 or 25 countries coming together, basically being motivated by the fear of ozone layer causing all sorts of health problems and environmental problems. And through advocacy and risk awareness and convincing some countries, they actually started expanding the group into full membership and put into place certain incentive mechanisms, like if you become a member, then you are not supposed to be subject to trade restrictions of trading with countries that are members of that group. And they also had certain technological transfers and financial transfers from advanced countries into developing countries. So the developing countries saw some benefit in it to join. So through these kinds of technological, financial incentives, advocacy and risk awareness, education campaigns across the world, they had a full membership, and this is regarded as one of the most successful examples of international cooperation. And in a similar way, they eradicated smallpox, which killed millions and millions of people over the 20th century. And very similar approach has been followed. So we see some hope that even though it's optimistic, there is some merit to it. So.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid, unfortunately, that we have to finish now, but there is a glass of champagne prepared for everyone. So if you have more questions and you want to directly talk to our World Bank experts, please feel free and enjoy the discussion. Thank you.